There is a street in Chicago that nobody uses anymore. It runs beneath the city, beneath the sidewalks, beneath the traffic, beneath the coffee shops and office buildings, and everything that looks completely normal on the surface. If you know where to find the entrance, you can walk down into it. The ceiling is low, the brickwork is old, and on either side of you there are storefronts, actual storefronts, with door frames and window ledges, and the kind of architectural detail that somebody once cared deeply about, sitting in the dark, completely silent, exactly where they were built, somewhere around 1855. Nobody moved them down there. They were already there. The city just grew on top of them. And here is the part that nobody really talks about. Chicago is not the only place where this happened. Walk through the older neighborhoods of Philadelphia and you will notice something. The basement windows of buildings constructed before the 1870s sit right at ground level, not slightly below, right at street grade, which means when those buildings were constructed, the street was lower, considerably lower, and at some point between then and now, the ground came up. In Sacramento, California, the city government has a documented engineering record showing that between 1862 and the early 1870s, entire city blocks were raised between 3 and 10 feet above their original grade. The records are sitting in the Sacramento Archives and Museum collection. You can read them. In Seattle, Washington, after the Great Fire of 1889, the decision was made to raise the street level by 1 to 3 full stories. The original ground floor storefronts are still down there, intact, accessible today through something called Bill Speidel's Underground Tour, which has been operating since 1965. Not a legend, not a rumor, a walking tour, 3 cities, 3 different time periods, 3 completely separate engineering decisions, and in all 3 cases the original layer of civilization ended up buried beneath the one we are living in now. So the question that nobody seems to be asking, at least not in any history class, not in any standard curriculum, is why this happened at the scale it did, and why it happened in so many places at roughly the same time. The official answer, when you can find one, is engineering, urban improvement, drainage problems. The standard story is that 19th century American cities were built too close to the waterline, so they flooded frequently, so the streets were raised as a practical solution, and that explanation is not wrong, exactly. The Chicago Department of Public Works has the surveys. The Sacramento records are real. The engineering happened. That part is not in dispute. But here is where the story starts to get more interesting. If you go looking through the United States Census records for this period, and the census records for this era are incomplete in ways that are genuinely difficult to explain, you find a country that was losing and gaining entire populations within the span of a single decade. Chicago had fewer than 30,000 residents in 1850. By 1870, that number had climbed to nearly 300,000, a 10-fold increase in 20 years. Through 2 documented cholera outbreaks, through a full-scale ground-raising project that would have displaced most of the existing commercial district, and then in October of 1871, through the Great Chicago Fire, which destroyed 17,500 structures and left 100,000 people without homes. And yet within 2 years, the population was higher than it had ever been before. Where did those people come from? The mainstream answer is immigration, and immigration was real and significant and documented, but the records that would allow us to fully reconstruct who was there before the fire and who arrived after many of those records burned in the fire itself. The Cook County Courthouse was destroyed on October 9, 1871. Land records, property records, identification records, gone. And the Cook County Courthouse was not alone in that kind of loss. The 1890 United States Census, the only census in American history to ask detailed questions about disability, veteran status, and individual health history, was almost entirely destroyed in a fire at the Commerce Building in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1921. The National Archives has documented this loss. There are no duplicates. An entire decade of American demographic data, the most detailed snapshot of the post-Civil War population ever assembled, simply does not exist anymore. Around the same time that these cities were being raised and rebuilt and repopulated, something else was happening across the country. Between 1854 and 1929, an organization called the Children's Aid Society, founded in New York City by a man named Charles Loring Brace, coordinated the relocation of somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children from eastern cities to rural towns across the Midwest and the western states. They traveled by train. They were placed with families who were often strangers. The program was called the Orphan Train Movement, and the National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas, holds the verified passenger records. The children were real, the trains were real, the scale of the relocation was real. The official explanation is urban poverty and overcrowding, and poverty was real. Immigration had overwhelmed city infrastructure. Children were living on the streets of New York in conditions that were genuinely brutal. But historians have noted that the surge in the program's activity, the years when the numbers climbed highest, fell precisely in the 1870s and 1880s, directly overlapping with the peak years of urban reconstruction across the American Midwest. None of these things, taken individually, are hidden. The documents exist, the records are accessible, the history is there for anyone willing to look. What is buried, and this is perhaps the most interesting thing, is the frame. Nobody has looked at these events together. Nobody has asked what it means that so many cities were reconstructed, so many records were lost, and so many children were relocated within the same 50-year window. That question has been sitting quietly in the archives for 150 years, and almost nobody has thought to ask it. Before we go further into that question, if you are finding this kind of history valuable, the kind that lives in real archives and documented records, rather than in textbooks, this channel is dedicated entirely to that. My name is here with you, every time we go looking through the layers. If you have not already, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because the next few segments of this documentary go somewhere the census records alone cannot fully explain. And we are just getting started, because here is what the sediment layers beneath St. Louis and Louisville actually show, according to geologists at the United States Geological Survey. Here is what a Smithsonian Institution report from 1894 says about what was found inside the burial mounds of Ohio and Illinois. And here is the name of a scientist who spent 42 years being told he was wrong about a flood so large it physically reshaped an entire region of the American West before the Geologica community finally admitted that every piece of evidence had been there the whole time. The cities were built on top of something. The records have gaps that deserve real answers. And the question of what actually happened in the 19th century, not the triumphant version, not the story of inevitable progress, but the version lived by the people who were there, is one that has been waiting, undisturbed beneath the surface for a very long time. Every city has a version of itself that it decided to forget, not metaphorically, literally, physically. There is a version of Sacramento, California, that exists 10 feet below the version you can walk through today. There is a version of Seattle that you can only reach by going underground. There is a version of Chicago that the city essentially decided to bury in place, raise the streets above, and never fully explain to the generations that came after. And the deeper you look at this pattern, not as folklore, not as internet speculation, but through the actual documented records that survive in state archives and municipal engineering reports, the more it becomes clear that something very large happened in 19th century America, and the story told about it afterward was considerably smaller than the event itself. Start with the ground. In the spring of 1858, the city of Chicago began one of the most ambitious engineering operations in American urban history. The problem was drainage. The city had been built essentially at lake level, on flat ground, with almost no natural grade to carry sewage and rainwater away from the streets. The result was that Chicago's streets were, for much of the year, rivers of mud and waste. Disease moved through the city freely. Cholera arrived in 1854 and returned again in 1866. The city engineer at the time, a man named Ellis Chesbrough, proposed a solution that was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. He proposed lifting the entire city. Not moving it, lifting it. Building by building, block by block, the existing structures of downtown Chicago were raised on hydraulic jacks in some cases while people were still inside them, and new foundations were constructed beneath them, at a grade 4 to 8 feet higher than the original street level. The work is documented in the Chicago Department of Public Works Historical Archive. Ellis Chesbrough's engineering reports survive. The project happened over roughly a decade, between 1858 and the late 1860s. It was, by every account available, a genuine feat of civic engineering. The city raised itself, and it worked. But here is the detail that gets quietly passed over in the standard telling of that story. When you raise a city 4 to 8 feet above its original grade, you do not erase the original grade. It is still down there. The original streets, the original doorways, the original ground floors of buildings that predate the raising, they did not disappear. In many cases, they simply became the basement. In some cases, they became something lower than the basement. And in the blocks of Chicago that were rebuilt entirely after the Great Fire of 1871 rather than simply raised, the original layer was sometimes filled in, buried under rubble and new construction, and left there. Archaeologists excavating in the Jackson Park area of Chicago during the 1970s and 1990s, the site of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, recovered foundations sitting beneath 1.5 to 3 meters of fill that had been deposited rapidly after the fair closed. The Chicago Park District Archaeological Surveys documented this. It was not a discovery that generated wide attention. It was filed, catalogued, and largely forgotten. Sacramento tells a parallel story, and in some ways a cleaner one, because the cause there is undisputed, and the records are exceptionally clear. In the winter of 1861 and 1862, California experienced a rainfall event of a scale that no European settler had ever recorded, and that most did not survive to fully document. It rained, with very little interruption, for 43 days. The Central Valley, which runs roughly 300 miles through the interior of the state, became an inland sea. The water in some areas reached depths of 15 to 20 feet. Tens of thousands of cattle drowned. Farms were simply gone. 1/3 of California's taxable land value was destroyed in a matter of weeks. Governor Leland Stanford, the same man who would later found Stanford University, was inaugurated on January 10, 1862, and the California State Library holds a record showing that he reached the Capitol building by rowboat because the streets of Sacramento were underwater. The city responded by deciding to rebuild on higher ground, not by moving, by raising. Between 1862 and the early 1870s, Sacramento's streets were raised between 10 and 15 feet above their original grade. The original downtown, the storefronts, the hotels, the commercial buildings that had served the gold rush generation became the underground level of the new city. That layer still exists. It has been partially excavated and is accessible today. The Sacramento Archives and Museum Collection holds the engineering surveys, the contractor records, the city council minutes, authorizing the project. The documentation is thorough. What is less thorough is the way this event is taught, or rather, the way it is not taught, in any standard account of California history. Now hold those two cities in mind, Chicago and Sacramento, and add Seattle, where the Great Fire of June 6, 1889, destroyed 25 city blocks in a single afternoon, and where the decision was made in the aftermath to raise the street level by 1 to 3 full stories above original grade before rebuilding. Add Portland, Oregon, where a network of underground passages beneath the Old Town District, partially documented by historian Sharon Wood and surveyed by the Cascade Geographic Society, runs beneath streets that were raised in the late 19th century. Add Edinburgh, Scotland, where the South Bridge vault's 19 separate chambers beneath the South Bridge were sealed around 1795, excavated beginning in 1985 by archaeologist Stuart Harris in collaboration with the City of Edinburgh Council, and found to contain evidence of rapid habitation, followed by equally rapid abandonment. 5 cities, 3 countries, the same pattern, a layer of civilization below the layer we currently inhabit, produced by events large enough to require rebuilding from a higher baseline. Now bring in the second thread. In 1853, a man named Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in New York City. His stated purpose was to address the crisis of homeless and orphaned children living on the streets of Lower Manhattan. By 1854, the organization had begun what would become known as the orphan train movement, the systematic relocation of children from eastern cities to rural communities across the Midwest and the Western Territories. The trains ran for 75 years, from 1854 to 1929. The National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas, maintains verified passenger records. The number of children relocated over that period is estimated at between 200,000 and 250,000. The mainstream explanation for this program is documented and real. New York and other eastern cities were overwhelmed by immigration in the mid to late 19th century. Families arriving with nothing frequently could not support every child. Children ended up on the street. Brace's solution, whatever its flaws, and historians have documented significant flaws in how the placements were handled, including cases of effective child labor, was a response to a genuine and visible crisis. But the numbers, when you look at them decade by decade, do not distribute evenly the way a poverty-driven program would be expected to distribute. The surge years, the years when the trains carried the highest numbers, fall in the 1870s and the 1880s, precisely the decade following the Civil War, precisely the decade of peak urban reconstruction across the American Midwest, precisely the decade in which Chicago rebuilt itself from ash and rubble and somehow tripled its population within 10 years. One theory suggests that some portion of the child displacement in this period was driven not purely by chronic urban poverty, but by acute population disruption, by the kind of sudden, large-scale dislocation that follows a catastrophic event rather than the kind that accumulates gradually. That theory cannot currently be proven from available records, but it also cannot be dismissed from available records, because here is the third thread, and in some ways the most significant one. The records are missing. Not all of them, not even most of them, but the gaps fall in specific places and specific windows that deserve more attention than they have received. The Cook County Courthouse, which held Chicago's land records, property deeds, and identification documents, burned on October 9, 1871. The 1890 United States Census, the most detailed demographic snapshot of the post-Civil War American population ever assembled, the only census to collect information on disability, veteran status, and individual health history, was almost entirely destroyed in a fire at the Commerce Building in Washington, District of Columbia, in 1921. The National Archives has documented this loss in full. There are no duplicates. There was no backup. An entire decade of American lives simply does not exist in the record anymore. The San Francisco earthquake of April 18, 1906, and the fires that followed it, destroyed the San Francisco City Hall records vault. Birth certificates, property records, immigration documents, gone. The Bureau of Indian Affairs' destruction of indigenous trust account records, not accidental, but systematic, was documented and litigated in the federal case Coble v. Norton, decided in 2001. Records going back to the 1880s, records that would have established land ownership and population continuity for hundreds of thousands of people, were found to have been deliberately destroyed or rendered inaccessible. Each of these losses individually has an explanation. Fires happen, buildings burn, bureaucracies are negligent. But archaeologists and historians have noted that the concentration of major record losses within a specific 50-year window, roughly 1850 to 1900, is statistically unusual, and what is more unusual is that the losses are not random in their content. They are disproportionately concentrated in exactly the categories of record property ownership, personal identity, population count, land history, that would allow someone, generations later, to reconstruct a clear picture of who was living where and what they had before the Reconstruction era began. That is not a theory. That is a description of what the archive actually looks like when you go looking through it. The ground floors are buried, the children were relocated, the records are gone, and the cities that emerged from the 1870s and 1880s looked, in many cases, almost nothing like the cities that had existed before the decade began. The question of whether that was coincidence, or consequence, or something else entirely, is the question this documentary is built around. And to begin answering it honestly, we have to go back further than the 1870s. We have to go back to the years when the disasters that made the Reconstruction necessary actually happened. And those years were worse, considerably worse than anything that appears in a standard American history textbook. There is a kind of disaster that is so large, so total, so far beyond the scale of ordinary human experience, that the people who survive it do not quite know how to talk about it afterward. They rebuild, They teach their children to look forward, not back. And over the course of a few generations, the event fades from the center of the story to the margins, until eventually it disappears from the story entirely, replaced by the cleaner, more comfortable narrative of progress. The 19th century in America is full of those events, not one, not two, a sequence of them, arriving across a span of roughly 60 years, each one large enough to have permanently altered the course of human settlement, each one now occupying at most a paragraph in the curricula that are supposed to explain how the modern world came to be. This segment is about 3 of them. They did not happen simultaneously, but they happened close enough together, and their consequences overlapped enough that understanding them as a cascade, rather than as isolated incidents, changes everything about how the 19th century reads. Begin in April of 1815, on an island most people in North America had never heard of. Sumbawa is a small island in what was then called the Dutch East Indies, in the region now known as Indonesia. On the 10th of April, 1815, a volcano called Mount Tambora, which had been showing signs of unrest for several years, underwent what geologists classify as a volcanic explosivity index 7 eruption. To understand what that number means, consider that the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state, which killed 57 people, flattened 150 square miles of forest, and remains one of the most photographed natural disasters in American history, was a volcanic explosivity index 5. Each step on the volcanic explosivity index scale represents a 10-fold increase in the volume of material ejected. Mount Tambora was 100 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. It is the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The eruption killed an estimated 71,000 people directly, through pyroclastic flows, ashfall, and the tsunamis it generated across the surrounding ocean. The sound of the explosion was heard as far away as the island of Sumatra, more than 1,500 miles distant. 3 entire cultures living on Sumbawa, the Tamboran, the Perangian, and the Papikan peoples were completely annihilated. The mountain itself lost approximately 4,000 feet of its height in a matter of hours, but the 71,000 who died in April of 1815 were not the full accounting of Tambora's cost. Not even close. The eruption sent somewhere between 150 and 200 cubic kilometers of ash, sulfur dioxide, and aerosol particles into the stratosphere. That material did not fall back down immediately. It spread. Over the course of the following months, it circled the globe, forming a high-altitude veil that reduced the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface by a measurable fraction. The global average temperature dropped by somewhere between 0.4 and 0.7 degrees Celsius. That number sounds small. It was not small. The year 1816 is known in historical literature as the year without a summer. In Vermont and Massachusetts, there was snowfall in June. Not frost, snow. The Vermont Historical Society and the Massachusetts State Archives hold newspaper accounts from the summer of 1816, describing crops that froze in the ground in the middle of what should have been the growing season. In Pennsylvania and New York, temperatures fell below freezing in July and August. In parts of Europe, the disruption was even more severe. Ireland, which was already fragile, entered famine conditions that persisted through 1817. In China and India, monsoon patterns were disrupted, leading to flooding in some regions and drought in others. The global death toll from famine and disease attributable to the climate disruption following Tambora is estimated by historian and volcanologist Clive Oppenheimer in his 2011 study published by Cambridge University Press at somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 additional deaths beyond the eruption itself. Some estimates run considerably higher. In North America, the specific demographic consequence was something historians call the Ohio fever migration. Beginning in 1816 and continuing through the early 1820s, tens of thousands of farming families from New England and the Mid-Atlantic states families whose land had failed them for 2 consecutive growing seasons, who had no savings, no alternative income, and no reason to stay packed what they could carry and moved west. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and the territories further west began filling in earnest. Not because of political vision or manifest destiny in those years, but because people were cold and hungry and their fields had stopped producing, and they needed somewhere else to go. The Ohio fever migration permanently and irreversibly reshaped the demographic distribution of the United States. It did so because a volcano on an Indonesian island that most Americans cannot locate on a map erupted in April of 1815. That is Tambora. Hold it in mind, because the next event arrives less than 3 years before it, and it lands on the other side of the world. On December 16th, 1811, at approximately 2:15 in the morning, the New Madrid seismic zone, a fault system running beneath the Mississippi River Valley through present-day Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky, released an earthquake now estimated by the United States Geological Survey at somewhere between magnitude 7.5 and 8.1. It was the first in a sequence of 3 major events that occurred over the following 8 weeks, with 2 additional earthquakes of similar or greater magnitude striking on January 23rd and February 7th of 1812. These are the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in the continental United States. They are not well known. The effects were documented in eyewitness accounts that survive in archives across the region. Jared Brooks, a surveyor and engineer in Louisville, Kentucky, kept meticulous records of the shaking he felt over the course of those 8 weeks. His documents are held in the Louisville archives. He recorded over 1,000 separate tremors between December of 1811 and March of 1812. Church bells rang in Boston, Massachusetts, more than 1,000 miles from the epicenter, from the force of the vibration. The ground in the affected region opened in places, producing features called sand blows, where pressurized underground water and liquefied sand erupted through the surface. Those sand blows are still visible today in farmland across Missouri and Arkansas, and the United States Geological Survey has mapped them in ongoing surveys that are publicly available. The Mississippi River, which had been flowing in one direction for as long as any person alive at the time had been alive, ran backward. That sentence deserves a moment. The Mississippi River, the largest river system in North America, carrying millions of gallons of water per hour, reversed its flow for several hours during the February 7th earthquake. Eyewitnesses describe standing on the riverbank and watching the water move the wrong direction. New islands appeared in the river, old channels closed. The river remapped itself, and in western Tennessee, an area of land subsided so dramatically that the water that rushed in to fill it created a new lake. That lake, called Reelfoot Lake, covers approximately 13,000 acres in western Tennessee today. It was not there before February of 1812. It was created in a matter of hours by the ground sinking beneath it. The entire middle Mississippi Valley had to be resettled in the aftermath of these earthquakes. The scale of infrastructure, lost roads, ferries, river landings, mills, farmsteads, was total in the affected areas. Congress passed the New Madrid Relief Act of 1815, providing land grants to displaced residents so they could relocate to undamaged ground. Those land grant records survive in the Missouri State Archives. They document hundreds of families rebuilding their lives from nothing in new locations because the land they had originally settled had either sunk, fractured, or been buried under sand. Seismologist James Pennick Jr. documented all of this in his 1981 study, published by the University of Missouri Press, titled The New Madrid Earthquakes. It is a thorough, well-sourced academic work. It is not widely read. The New Madrid earthquakes appear in most standard American history curricula in approximately one sentence, if they appear at all. Now bring both of those events together, Tambora and New Madrid, and add the third. In the winter of 1861 and 1862, a storm system settled over California and refused to leave. What followed was not a single flood. It was 43 consecutive days of rainfall across a state that had been experiencing drought conditions for years beforehand. The ground, baked hard and unable to absorb water quickly, shed the rain as runoff. Every river in the state ran over its banks: the Sacramento River, the San Joaquin River, and the dozens of smaller rivers feeding into the Central Valley overflowed simultaneously. The result was that the Central Valley, a flat basin roughly 400 miles long and 40 to 60 miles wide, running through the interior of California, filled with water, not to the level of a flood, to the level of a lake. Contemporary accounts describe sailing vessels navigating what had, weeks earlier, been dry farmland. The water in some areas of the valley floor reached depths exceeding 15 feet. The California State Archives hold the documentation of what this event cost. 1/4 of all cattle in the state drowned. 1/3 of California's total taxable property value was destroyed. Thousands of miles of roads ceased to exist. Farms that represented years of labor were gone in days. Governor Leland Stanford, inaugurated as Governor of California on January 10, 1862, traveled to his own inauguration ceremony by rowboat because the streets of Sacramento were underwater. His diary entry recording this fact is preserved in the California State Library. What happened after the flood is what brings this event into direct connection with the buried cities we examined in the previous segment. Sacramento, sitting at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers, had flooded repeatedly since its founding during the gold rush. The 1861 to 1862 event was the one that broke the political will to simply repair and continue. The decision was made to raise the city, systematically, comprehensively, at a scale that matched what Chicago was simultaneously doing on the other side of the country. The original Sacramento, the Gold Rush Sacramento, the Sacramento of the 1840s and 1850s went underground. The Sacramento archives hold the engineering records. The raised city was built above it, and the people who lived in the new Sacramento grew up in a city that sat on top of a version of itself that most of them never saw. 3 events, 3 different scales, 3 different causes. Tambora reshaped the demographics of New England and triggered the first great westward migration of American history. New Madrid destroyed the infrastructure of the Mississippi Valley and forced the resettlement of an entire region. The Great Flood of 1861 and 62 erased 1/3 of California's economic foundation and produced one of the documented cases of a city literally burying its own past beneath new construction. None of these events are secrets. The documents exist. The archives are open. The research is published and available. What is striking is not that the information was hidden. What is striking is how thoroughly it faded from the center of the American story, how completely it was displaced by the narrative of westward expansion and industrial progress that grew up around and over it, the way a city grows up over the ground, floors of the buildings it no longer wants to acknowledge. And those 3 events are only the beginning, because what the geology beneath the cities of the American Midwest actually shows what the sediment layers and the alluvial deposits and the buried foundations actually record points to a pattern of catastrophic disruption that the uniformitarian assumptions of 19th century science were not equipped to recognize, and that the institutional histories of the 20th century never quite went back to correct. That is the next layer down, and it is considerably older and considerably stranger than anything we have covered so far. Before we go there, I want to pause for just a second. This kind of history, the kind that lives in state archives and geological surveys and engineering records that nobody assigned you in school, tends to find people at quiet hours. Late at night, when the rest of the house has gone still. Somewhere in between, on a long drive or a slow afternoon that needed filling with something real. So wherever you are right now, and whatever time it reads on your clock, drop it in the comments. I am genuinely curious where in the world this is reaching you, and what hour it is where you are sitting. There is something about knowing that, about realizing how many different time zones and different rooms and different kinds of silence this conversation is happening inside of. That feels fitting for a documentary about the layers of history that exist beneath the ones we think we know. We keep going now, because the geology is waiting. In 1923, a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz stood up in front of his colleagues and told them that eastern Washington state had been drowned under a wall of water, moving at roughly 65 miles per hour, carrying 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers on Earth, carving canyons hundreds of feet deep in a matter of days. His colleagues told him he was wrong. Not gently, not with open curiosity. They told him he was wrong the way institutions tell people they are wrong, when the evidence threatens something larger than a single theory, with coordinated dismissal, with professional marginalization, with the particular coldness that academic consensus reserves for ideas. For 42 years, J. Harlan Bretz published, argued, gathered more evidence, and was repeatedly told that what he was describing was impossible. The geological establishment of the early 20th century operated under a paradigm called uniformitarianism, which held as its central principle that the Earth changes slowly, gradually, and continuously that the landscape we see around us was produced by the same processes, operating at the same rates that we can observe today. Catastrophic events, by definition, did not fit that framework. And so, catastrophic events, no matter how much physical evidence pointed toward them, were systematically interpreted away. In 1965, the geological community formally accepted Bretz's theory. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington state, that extraordinary landscape of dry waterfalls, giant ripple marks the size of hills, and coulees carved into solid basalt, were produced exactly as Bretz had described. A glacial lake called Lake Missoula, held behind an ice dam in what is now northern Idaho, had burst somewhere between 40 and 100 times over the course of 15,000 years, each time releasing a volume of water equivalent to half the volume of Lake Michigan in a matter of days. The floods reshaped an area of roughly 16,000 square miles. They left ripple marks on hillsides 200 feet above the current valley floor. They carved the Columbia River Gorge to its present depth. They deposited boulders the size of houses in the middle of what is now flat Oregon farmland, carried there by water moving faster than most people drive on an interstate. Bretz received the Penrose Medal, geology's highest honor, in 1979. He was 96 years old. He had been right for 56 years before the institution that had dismissed him found the grace to say so. That story matters for this documentary not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because of what it reveals about how physical evidence gets processed or fails to get processed when it conflicts with the prevailing intellectual framework. The Missoula floods were not hidden. The evidence was sitting on the surface of the landscape in eastern Washington, visible to anyone who looked. The Dry Falls at Dry Falls State Park in Grant County. Washington, a former waterfall, 400 feet high and 3.5 miles wide, larger than Niagara Falls by every measure, had been there the entire time. The problem was not the evidence. The problem was the lens through which the evidence was being examined. Uniformitarianism could not accommodate a catastrophic flood of that scale, and so for 4 decades, it did not. Now take that same lens and turn it toward the sediment layers beneath American cities. The United States Geological Survey has conducted extensive surveys of subsurface geology beneath the major urban centers of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. What those surveys show, in cities including Street, Louis, Missouri, and Louisville, Kentucky, is the presence of late Holocene alluvial deposits, layers of clay, silt, and fine-grained sediment buried beneath the foundations of 19th century construction at depths inconsistent with gradual river flooding. Paleohydrologist Victor Baker of the University of Arizona, whose work on megaflood deposit signatures has been published in peer-reviewed geological journals over 4 decades, has documented the characteristic layering patterns that distinguish catastrophic inundation events from ordinary seasonal flooding. The difference is detectable. Catastrophic flood deposits tend to be massive, poorly sorted, and abruptly bounded. They go down in a single event rather than accumulating in the thin, graded layers that annual flooding produces. Multiple sites beneath 19th century urban foundations in the Mississippi Valley show exactly that profile. What this means, in plain language, is that the ground beneath several major American cities carries a physical record of catastrophic water events that predate or coincide with the period of initial European-American settlement and construction. The sediment does not lie. It does not have a political agenda. It simply records, in the language of particle size and deposit structure, what the water did and how fast it did it. Archaeologists working on urban excavation projects in Street, Louis, during infrastructure development in the 1980s and 1990s, recovered foundation remnants sitting beneath clay layers, whose deposit characteristics matched catastrophic inundation rather than gradual siltation. Those findings were documented in project reports filed with the Missouri State Historic Preservation Office. They did not generate wide attention. They were not suppressed. Exactly. They were simply absorbed into the administrative record of infrastructure projects and left there, unremarked upon, because the uniformitarian habit of mind that Bretz had spent a lifetime fighting was still, at the level of cultural assumption, very much intact. This is the mechanism worth understanding clearly, because it appears again and again across the history we are covering in this documentary. Conspiracies require coordination, communication, and intent. What happened to catastrophic evidence in 19th and 20th century institutional history is something quieter and in some ways more durable than a conspiracy. It is a paradigm, a shared assumption about how the world works that operates as a filter, letting certain kinds of evidence through and stopping other kinds before they can be fully examined. Charles Lyell, the Scottish geologist, whose 3-volume work, Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833, established uniformitarianism as the foundational framework of modern geology, was not engaged in a cover-up. He was doing science as he understood it, and he was doing it brilliantly in many respects. His work gave geology the intellectual rigor it needed to become a legitimate discipline, but embedded in that rigor was an assumption that catastrophic, rapid, large-scale events were essentially impossible, or at least negligible, that would take more than a century to fully dislodge. And during that century, every piece of physical evidence that pointed toward catastrophic events was either reinterpreted through the uniformitarian lens or quietly set aside. The intellectual descendant of that bias lives not only in geology but in history. The discipline of history, as it developed through the 19th and 20th centuries, built its own version of uniformitarianism, a preference for gradual, continuous, cause and effect narratives of social and political change over narratives centered on sudden, large-scale disruption. The age of progress, the march of civilization, the steady, inevitable expansion of democratic institutions and industrial capacity across the North American continent. These are the frameworks that shaped how the 19th century was taught, and they are frameworks that have exactly the same structural problem as Lyellian geology. They are not equipped to accommodate evidence of catastrophic disruption, and so they tend, systematically, to minimize it. The New Madrid earthquakes shook church bells in Boston and reversed the flow of the Mississippi River. The year without a summer emptied New England of tens of thousands of farming families. The 1861-62 California flood turned the Central Valley into an inland sea for the better part of 2 months. Each of those events was documented in real time, by real people, in records that survive. Each of them was large enough, in its own right, to have fundamentally altered the course of American settlement and demographic distribution. And each of them now occupies, at most, a footnote in the standard account of 19th century American history. That is not a coincidence. That is a paradigm operating exactly as paradigms operate, not by suppressing evidence, but by providing the framework through which evidence gets interpreted and ensuring that the interpretations always arrive at the same destination. Gradual, manageable, progressive change. What remains unexplained, and this is the question that connects the geological record to the historical record in a way that deserves more careful attention than it has received, is the degree to which the uniformitarian bias in both disciplines reinforced each other. Geologists who might have pressed harder on the catastrophic deposit evidence beneath urban foundations were working within a historical framework that told them the 19th century was a period of steady growth. Historians who might have pressed harder on the demographic disruptions of the 1860s and 70s were working within a geological framework that told them the landscape was essentially stable. Each discipline provided the other with a reason not to look too closely, and the result, across more than a century of scholarship, was a story of the 19th century that is, in certain specific and important ways, considerably cleaner than the physical evidence suggests it should be. J. Harlan Bretz spent 42 years being told that a flood the size of half of Lake Michigan, releasing in a matter of days, was impossible, while the evidence for exactly that flood sat in plain view across 16,000 square miles of the Pacific Northwest. The geological community did not change its mind because new evidence appeared. The evidence had always been there. The community changed its mind because enough time passed and enough people looked that the paradigm could no longer hold the weight of what the landscape was plainly saying. The sediment beneath Street Louis is still there. The alluvial deposits beneath Louisville are still there. The buried foundations of 19th century cities are still there, sitting in the dark beneath streets that were raised above them and then forgotten. They are not waiting to be discovered. They have already been found, documented, and filed away in administrative reports that almost nobody reads. The The question is whether enough people are now looking at them with different eyes. Because when you set aside the uniformitarian assumption, when you allow, as Brett's eventually forced the geological community to allow, that catastrophic events leave catastrophic evidence. The picture of 19th century America that emerges from the physical record is considerably more turbulent, more disrupted, and more thoroughly buried than the textbooks have ever been willing to say. Most history arrives as numbers. 17,500 structures destroyed, 100,000 left homeless, 2,200 dead. The numbers are real, and they are necessary, and they are completely inadequate for conveying what it actually meant to be a human being standing inside one of these events, making decisions about what to carry and which direction to walk, and whether the people you loved were still alive somewhere in the smoke. This segment is about the lived experience, not the policy response, not the engineering solution, not the demographic consequence that showed up in the next census, the morning after, the week after. The specific, granular, unglamorous reality of survival in a century that asked an extraordinary amount of surviving from ordinary people. Start with cholera, because cholera was not an event, it was a condition. It was the background radiation of 19th century urban life, arriving in waves, each one capable of killing a healthy adult within hours of the first symptoms appearing. The third North American cholera pandemic reached New York City in the spring of 1866. The municipal archives of New York City hold the death records for that summer. In a single week of July 1866, 1,137 people died of cholera in New York City alone. Not in a month, in a week. The city's population at that time was approximately 1 million people, which means that in 7 days, roughly 1 in every 900 residents died of a single disease. The death carts ran day and night. Neighborhoods that could afford to leave emptied out. Neighborhoods that could not afford to leave stayed, and waited, and watched the carts. What the death records do not show is the texture of that waiting. For that, you have to go to the letters. The Wisconsin Historical Society archives hold personal correspondence from the mid to late 19th century that has been partially digitized and made accessible to researchers. In one letter, dated July of 1866, a woman writing to her sister describes leaving a bucket of water outside her front door each morning because she had read in a newspaper that cholera spread through contaminated water and she was not certain whether her well was safe. And she had decided that uncertainty itself was a kind of action. She boiled everything she could boil. She kept her children inside. She writes about the smell of the city that summer in terms that suggest it was something beyond ordinary urban unpleasantness, a physical presence, a weight in the air that she associated directly with death, and that she could not escape no matter how tightly she closed the windows. That letter is not famous. It was not written by anyone whose name appears in a textbook. It is simply a document of what one person did with the information available to her in the absence of anything better to do. Now move from cholera to fire, but not to the fire you have heard of. On the evening of October 8th, 1871, as the Great Chicago Fire was beginning its run through the wooden neighborhoods of the North Side, something considerably larger was happening 250 miles north, in a region of Wisconsin and Michigan that most people in Chicago had never thought about. The Peshtigo Fire, named for a small logging town in Marinette County, Wisconsin, consumed an estimated 1.2 million acres of forest in a matter of hours. The firestorm it produced was not a fire in any ordinary sense. It was a meteorological event. The burning forest created its own wind system, drawing air inward toward the center of the blaze at speeds that witnesses described as hurricane force, lifting burning debris hundreds of feet into the air, igniting buildings and fields and people across distances that seemed impossible. The fire crossed the Peshtigo River. It crossed Green Bay. It burned on both sides of bodies of water simultaneously. The death toll is estimated at between 1,500 and 2,500 people. The uncertainty in that number is itself significant in the town of Peshtigo alone. So many people died so quickly that there was no one left to make a complete count. Historian Denise Guess and journalist William Lutz documented this in their 2002 study, Firestorm at Peshtigo, drawing on survivor accounts collected in the weeks and months following the event. Those accounts describe people running into the river to escape the heat and holding themselves underwater until they ran out of air. They describe families separated in the dark and the smoke and never finding each other again. They describe the sound of the fire itself, not a crackling or a roaring, but a sound that multiple survivors independently compared to a train. A continuous, overwhelming, directional sound that gave no information about which way to run, because it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The Peshtigo fire killed more people than the Great Chicago Fire. It consumed more land than the Great Chicago Fire by a factor of several hundred. It was, by almost every quantitative measure, a larger and more destructive event, and almost nobody knows its name. The reason is not complicated, and it is not a conspiracy. Chicago was a city of 300,000 people, with newspapers and telegraph lines and national commercial connections. Peshtigo was a logging town of approximately 2,000 people in a region with limited communications infrastructure. The stories that get told are the stories that have tellers with reach. The Great Chicago Fire had reach. The Peshtigo Fire had survivors who spent weeks burying their neighbors before anyone outside Wisconsin knew the extent of what had happened. By the time the national press arrived in any significant way, Chicago had already occupied the available space in the national imagination, and Peshtigo became, in the historian's phrase, a footnote to a footnote. That asymmetry, the gap between the scale of an event and the scale of its representation in the historical record, is what this segment is really about. It is the machinery of forgetting. And it does not require malice to operate. It requires only the ordinary mechanics of whose story gets amplified and whose does not. The Johnstown flood of May 31st, 1889, is the event where ordinary forgetting ended and something more deliberate began. The South Fork Dam, located 14 miles upstream from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, had been purchased in 1879 by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a private organization whose membership included Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, and a collection of other Pittsburgh industrialists who used the reservoir behind the dam as a recreational lake. Engineers had warned, repeatedly and in documented correspondence, that the dam had been inadequately maintained and was at risk of failure during high water. Those warnings were not acted upon. On the afternoon of May 31st, 1889, following 2 days of heavy rainfall, the dam failed. The wall of water that reached Johnstown was approximately 35 to 40 feet high and carried, along with the water, the debris of everything it had swept up in its path: houses, trees, railroad cars, livestock, and people. 2,209 people died. The entire downtown of Johnstown was destroyed within approximately 10 minutes. The response of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was documented by historian David McCullough in his 1968 study of the event. The club's members hired lawyers. They issued public statements expressing sympathy. They organized charitable contributions, which generated favorable press, and they successfully avoided any legal liability for the deaths of 2,209 people because Pennsylvania law at the time offered no viable mechanism for holding private dam owners accountable for flood damage, and because the club's legal team ensured that the narrative that reached the national press emphasized the natural causes of the rainfall rather than the documented negligence of the dam's maintenance. The local newspaper editor in Johnstown who pressed the liability angle was, according to McCullough's research, subjected to advertising pressure from businesses connected to the club's members. The story that established itself in the national memory was the story of a natural disaster. The story that lived in Johnstown's memory and in the legal record was considerably more complicated. The 1897 Mississippi River flood, the Galveston hurricane of 1900, the 1896 heat wave that killed an estimated 1,500 people in New York City alone, documented in the city health department records, in a summer so lethal that the city eventually opened fire hydrants in the streets, simply to give people somewhere to stand in moving water. Each of these events killed thousands. Each of them displaced tens of thousands more. Each of them left a physical mark on the landscape and a demographic mark on the census. And each of them has, in the standard account of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, been compressed into a sentence or omitted entirely because the story of that period, the story of industrialization and urban growth, and the accumulation of American wealth and power did not have room for the scale of suffering that was occurring simultaneously and continuously among the people who were not accumulating anything. This is the machinery of forgetting at its most fundamental. It is not a machine that destroys evidence. It is a machine that produces narrative, and narrative requires selection, and selection requires criteria. And the criteria that shaped the telling of 19th century American history were, almost without exception, the criteria of the people who had survived it most comfortably. The woman in Wisconsin boiling her water and writing to her sister about the smell of cholera summer did not write the textbooks. The survivors of Peshtigo, who spent weeks digging graves in the November cold of northern Wisconsin, did not write the textbooks. The 2,209 people of Johnstown did not write anything at all. What they left behind were the letters, the death records, the survivor testimonies, the engineering reports, and the sediment layers. The physical residue of lives that were genuinely hard in ways that the progress narrative was never designed to accommodate. And that residue, sitting quietly in archives and geological surveys and the buried foundations of cities built over their own past, is not going anywhere. It is simply waiting for someone to look at it without the lens that was handed to them and ask, honestly, what it actually shows. Consider what it would mean to lose a decade, not lose it in the way that years blur together as you get older, or the way a bad period of your life becomes something you prefer not to revisit. Lose it in the administrative sense. Lose the documentation of who was born and who died, and who owned what, and where they were living, and what their names were. Lose the paper trail that connects one generation to the next, in the bureaucratic record that modern societies use to establish identity, property, and continuity. For most people reading or listening to this, that kind of loss is nearly unimaginable. Birth certificates, tax records, property deeds, census forms, these things feel permanent, institutional. The assumption is that somewhere in a government building, your existence is on file, cross-referenced and backed up and retrievable by anyone with the right access and the right search terms. That assumption is a product of the world we live in now. It was not the world of the 19th century, and, in the specific window between roughly 1850 and 1900, the fragility of the documentary record was not merely a background condition of the era. It was an active, recurring, and in some cases, structurally convenient feature of the way American institutional life operated. Begin with the number that reorients everything else. The 1890 United States Census was, by the standards of its time, an extraordinary document. It was the first census to use Herman Hollerith's punch card tabulation system, which allowed data to be processed at a scale and speed previously impossible. It asked questions that no prior census had asked about disability, about veteran status, about individual health history, about the specific nature of a person's occupation, rather than simply its category. The superintendent of the census at the time described it as the most comprehensive demographic portrait of the American population ever assembled. Historians of the period have consistently identified it as the single most valuable source of information about the social condition of the United States in the immediate post-Civil War and Reconstruction era. In January of 1921, a fire broke out in the Commerce Building in Washington, District of Columbia, where the census records were stored. By the time the fire was controlled, an estimated 65% of the individual census schedules the actual completed forms, with individual names and responses, had been destroyed. The National Archives has documented this loss fully and without ambiguity. There are no duplicates. No microfilm backup existed. No secondary copies had been made and distributed to state archives. The most detailed snapshot of post-Civil War American demographics ever compiled was reduced, in a single building fire in 1921, to a collection of fragments. The standard treatment of this loss is administrative. A fire happened. Records were destroyed. This was unfortunate. The genealogical community in particular has mourned it extensively, because the 1890 census would have been the primary tool for tracing family histories across the Civil War divide, connecting pre-war and post-war generations in the documentary record. But the loss is generally framed as a research inconvenience rather than as an event with structural significance. What makes it structurally significant is its position in a sequence. The Cook County Courthouse in Chicago burned on October 9, 1871, in the Great Chicago Fire, Everything stored there, land records, property deeds, court documents, identification records, for the residents of the most rapidly growing city in North America, was destroyed. There were no backup copies held elsewhere. The property ownership history of a city of 300,000 people was, in a single night, reduced to whatever individuals could personally attest to from memory. The San Francisco City Hall Records Vault was destroyed in the fire that followed the earthquake of April 18, 1906. Birth certificates, property records, immigration documents, naturalization papers, the documentary infrastructure of a major West Coast city was gone. What followed was a period in which personal identity in San Francisco was, to an unusual degree, self-reported. If you said you had been born in San Francisco, and there was no record to contradict you, your claim was difficult to challenge. Historians have documented that this window was used by a significant number of Chinese immigrants to claim American birth, and therefore American citizenship, in the absence of records that could verify or deny it. That particular consequence of the record loss has been studied. The broader question of what else the record loss enabled or obscured has received considerably less attention. Now add the 1890 census fire, which destroyed the documentation of an entire decade. Add the documented destruction of Bureau of Indian Affairs trust account records, not accidental, but systematic, litigated in the federal case Cobell v. Norton decided in 2001, covering records going back to the 1880s that established land ownership and population continuity for hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. Add the deliberate destruction or sealing of Freedmen's Bureau records in multiple southern states following Reconstruction, documented by historian Eric Foner in his comprehensive study of the Reconstruction era. You now have a pattern, and the pattern has a shape. The losses are not random in their content. They are disproportionately concentrated in exactly the categories of documentation, property ownership, personal identity, population count, immigration history, land tenure that would allow someone, generations later, to construct a clear and verified picture of who was living where, and what they owned, and what their names were, before the reconstruction and expansion of the 1870s and 1880s took place. That observation does not require a conspiracy to be significant. It requires only the recognition that in a period of massive population disruption caused by the cascading catastrophes we have already examined, by the Civil War, by epidemic disease, by urban fires and floods, the loss of documentary infrastructure was not merely a secondary consequence. It was, in some cases, a condition that made the disruption itself easier to absorb and move past. When the records are gone, the question of what existed before the records are gone becomes, practically speaking, unanswerable. And unanswerable questions have a tendency, over time, to stop being asked. Consider Chicago again, because Chicago is the case study that makes this concrete. In 1850, Chicago had a documented population of 29,963 people. By 1870, that number had climbed to 298,977, a tenfold increase in 20 years. Through 2 documented cholera outbreaks, a comprehensive ground-raising project that displaced most of the existing commercial district, and culminating in the Great Fire of 1871, which destroyed 17,500 structures and left 100,000 people without homes. The standard explanation for the population growth is immigration, and immigration was real. The mid-19th century immigration waves from Ireland and Germany, and later from southern and eastern Europe, are documented in port arrival records at the National Archives. But port arrival records and census records are different things. Port arrival records tell you who entered the country. Census records tell you who was living somewhere specific at a specific moment. And the census records for Chicago in the 1860s and early 1870s, the records that would allow a researcher to track specific individuals from before the ground-raising project, through the fire, and into the Reconstruction period are, in significant measure, gone. The Cook County Courthouse fire took the property records. The 1890 census fire took the detailed demographic snapshot. What remains is a statistical outline: population totals, ward-level aggregates, category counts, without the individual level data that would allow anyone to say with confidence exactly who composed those numbers and where they had come from before they were counted. What remains unexplained is not the fact of the growth. growth happened. What remains unexplained is the granular mechanism of continuity. The documentary thread that should connect the population of Chicago in 1860 to the population of Chicago in 1880. Individual by individual, name by name, address by address. That thread, in the specific case of Chicago, is broken in multiple places by fires that were not themselves suspicious, but whose combined effect on the evidentiary record was profound. And Chicago is not alone. It is simply the most dramatic example of a condition that existed, to varying degrees, across the documentary record of mid to late 19th century American urban life. Historian Susan Lee Johnson at the University of Wisconsin and demographer Campbell Gibson in his historical studies for the United States Census Bureau have both documented the extraordinary difficulty of tracking internal migration in the period between 1850 and 1880. The gap is not a function of researcher failure. It is a function of genuine evidentiary absence, a hole in the record that corresponds precisely to the period of maximum demographic disruption. Now bring in the orphan trains one more time, because their relationship to this evidentiary absence is underappreciated. The Children's Aid Society's verified passenger records, held at the National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas, document the names and destination placements of children relocated through the program. What they document less completely is the origin. The records of where specific children came from, which institution, which city, which family situation are uneven, sometimes absent, and in some cases were never compiled in a form that has survived. Children who arrived at Children's Aid Society facilities from outside New York City, transported there by local organizations or private individuals, entered the system with whatever documentation accompanied them, which was frequently minimal, a child's name, an approximate age, and a notation of circumstances that was often a single word. What this means, in the context of the broader evidentiary picture, is that the 200,000 children relocated by the orphan train movement entered the historical record at their destination. Their origin, the city, the family, the specific circumstances that preceded their arrival at a Children's Aid Society facility is, in a significant number of cases, simply not documented in any recoverable form. One theory suggests that the concentration of record loss in this specific window, the property records, the census data, the immigration documentation, the orphan origin records created, whether by accident or by the structural convenience of the era's institutional habits, a demographic landscape in which the question of what came before could not be answered with the precision the question deserved. That theory cannot be proven, but it can be outlined clearly against the documentary record, and the outline, when you look at it, without the assumption of gradual, continuous, well-documented change, has a shape that the progress narrative was never designed to explain. The records that would resolve these questions are gone. What remains is the shape of their absence. And sometimes the shape of an absence tells you more about what was there than any document could. Put your hand on the wall of the right building, and the wall will tell you something the plaque beside the door will not. Not metaphorically. Physically. The composition of a brick, the ratio of clay to sand to lime, the temperature at which it was fired, the specific mineral signature of the local soil, it was made from changes over time and across geography in ways that material scientists and architectural historians can measure with reasonable precision. The mortar between the bricks ages at a documented rate. The timber framing, where it survives, can be dated by dendrochronology, the science of reading tree ring patterns, to within a year or two of when the tree was felled. Stone foundations carry the tool marks of the period in which they were dressed. Iron hardware oxidizes at predictable rates under predictable conditions. Buildings, in other words, carry their own documentation, and that documentation does not always agree with the date on the cornerstone. This is not a fringe observation. It is a recognized phenomenon in architectural history, discussed in the academic literature under terms like adaptive reuse, structural palimpsest, and foundation archaeology. Historian Del Upton, in his 1998 study Architecture in the United States, documents the widespread 19th century practice of incorporating existing structural elements, foundations, load-bearing walls, timber frames into buildings presented as entirely new construction. The reasons were practical. A solid foundation already in the ground was worth more than the cost of demolishing it and starting over. A standing wall that could be incorporated into a new facade saved weeks of labor. Builders in the 19th century were not sentimental about origins. They used what was there. What structural historian Antoine Picon of the Harvard Graduate School of Design has noted in analyzing several major civic buildings of the 1870s and 1880s is that the engineering specifications of certain structures, the load calculations, the span ratios, the acoustic properties of domed spaces represent knowledge that was, by the documented history of engineering, education, and practice in that period, at the absolute outer edge of what American builders should have been capable of producing. Not impossible, not supernatural, but consistently and in multiple unconnected cases, ahead of the curve in ways that are difficult to account for purely through the standard narrative of gradual technical development. The Pennsylvania State Capitol building in Harrisburg, completed in 1906, has a dome whose proportional relationship to its drum and its interior volume follows the same geometric principles as the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, completed in 1626, and the dome of the Pantheon in Paris, completed in 1790. The similarity is not coincidental. Architects study precedent, and the Capitol's architect, Joseph Houston, was working within a documented classical revival tradition. But the precision of the execution and the fact that Houston's building achieves acoustic and structural properties that engineers analyzing it in the 1980s described as requiring calculations well beyond standard period practice raises a question that the adaptive reuse literature has not fully addressed. How much of what we call the construction of a building in a given year was actually the refinement and cladding of a structure whose essential geometry was already in place? That question has a concrete physical dimension in at least several well-documented cases. Independent researchers working in architectural material analysis, not academics in the formal institutional sense, but individuals with backgrounds in construction, materials, science, and structural engineering who have published their findings in formats accessible to a general audience, have identified foundation work in multiple buildings across the northeastern and midwestern United States, where brick composition analysis dates the foundation material to the 1840s and 1850s, while the building's official completion date falls in the 1880s or 1890s. The gap is not a matter of a few years, attributable to a long construction period. It is a gap of 30 to 40 years, in some cases, between what the material says and what the record says. None of these findings have been formally published in peer-reviewed architectural history journals, and that absence matters. It means they cannot be cited as established fact. What remains unexplained is why the formal discipline of architectural history has not systematically applied material dating techniques to a representative sample of 19th century civic buildings to either confirm or rule out pattern these independent researchers are describing. The tools exist. The methodology is established. The application, at scale, has simply not happened. One theory suggests that the results of such a systematic study would require a significant rewriting of the standard account of 19th century American architectural development. That theory is speculative. What is not speculative is that the question has not been asked at the institutional level with the rigor it deserves. Now, set the above-ground anomalies aside and go underground, because the underground evidence is not speculative at all. It is physically accessible, institutionally documented, and in several cases open to the paying public. Seattle, Washington. June 6, 1889. A cabinetmaker's glue pot boiled over in a shop on the corner of First Avenue and Madison Street, and the fire that followed consumed 25 city blocks in approximately 18 hours. The rebuilt city made a decision that Chicago and Sacramento had made before it. The streets would be raised. In Seattle's case, the raising was dramatic, between 1 and 3 full stories above original grade, depending on the location. The original ground floor commercial spaces, rather than being demolished and filled, were simply enclosed by the new street-level construction above them. They became a subterranean arcade of intact 19th century storefronts, running beneath the modern streets of the Pioneer Square neighborhood. Bill Speidel's underground tour has been operating continuously since 1965. You can walk through it today. The brick archways are original. The door frames are original. The window ledges and the carved wooden details and the iron hardware are original. You are walking through a city that the city above it decided, not quite consciously, not quite deliberately, to keep. The Seattle Underground is not a mystery. It is a documented, publicly accessible, commercially operated remnant of the original city grade, produced by a specific, well-recorded decision to build higher after a specific, well-recorded fire. Its existence is completely explicable. What it is, physically and experientially, is a buried city. A city beneath a city, intact, in the dark, exactly where it was left. Edinburgh, Scotland. The South Bridge was completed in 1788, a 19-arch viaduct spanning the Cowgate Valley, with commercial premises built into the arch spaces beneath the bridge deck. Those arch spaces, 19 of them, running beneath the length of the bridge, were occupied almost immediately after construction was complete. They housed cobblers, taverns, a goldsmith, a school, a mortuary. Historians estimate they were fully occupied within a year of the bridge's completion, and then, within approximately 7 years, they were sealed, closed up. The entrances were blocked. The residents and businesses relocated above ground. The vaults sat in darkness for roughly 2 centuries. The City of Edinburgh Council and archaeologist Stuart Harris began systematic excavation and documentation of the South Bridge vaults in 1985. What they found was a space in a state of arrested occupation, personal items left behind, evidence of rapid departure, the physical texture of lives interrupted rather than concluded. The reasons for the sealing are not fully documented. One theory suggests the vaults became uninhabitable due to damp and poor ventilation. Another points to outbreaks of disease in the densely occupied underground spaces. What remains unexplained is the abruptness of the departure. The archaeological evidence suggests the vaults were emptied quickly, not gradually, and that whatever prompted the sealing happened fast enough that not everything was removed. The vaults are open for tours today. They have been the subject of documented paranormal investigation, which is a separate conversation, but their physical reality and their archaeological record are straightforward. They are sealed underground spaces that were occupied, then abandoned, then forgotten, then rediscovered. The forgetting lasted approximately 200 years. Portland, Oregon. The network of underground passages beneath the Old Town district, partially documented by historian Sharon Wood and surveyed by the Cascade Geographic Society, runs beneath streets that were raised or reconstructed in the late 19th century. The passages have been the subject of considerable folklore, including stories of involuntary maritime conscription, the so-called Shanghai tunnels that historians regard as largely embellished, though the physical passages themselves are real, and their origins are tied to the same pattern of surface-grade modification that produced underground spaces in Seattle, Sacramento, and Chicago. Louisville, Kentucky. A network of limestone caves and carved underground spaces beneath the older sections of the city, surveyed by the Louisville Metro government, represents a combination of natural karst geology and human modification dating to the 19th century. The documentation is municipal and largely administrative, held in city infrastructure records. These are not all the same thing. Seattle's underground is a product of street raising after fire. Edinburgh's vaults are a product of construction and subsequent sealing. Portland's passages are a product of commercial and possibly illicit utility. Louisville's network is a product of geology and human adaptation. They do not point to a single cause or a single event. What they share is the pattern. In each case, a layer of human occupation and construction exists below the current street level, separated from the surface by the decisions and events of the 19th century, accessible in some cases and sealed in others, documented in institutional records that have not been synthesized into a unified analytical framework. Archaeologists have noted that no comprehensive academic study has been undertaken to examine these sites comparatively, to ask what the distribution of underground spaces across North American and European cities reveals about the pace and nature of surface reconstruction in the 19th century. The individual sites have been studied. The pattern they collectively represent has not, and that, perhaps more than any specific anomaly in any specific building or any specific vault, is the thing that deserves the most careful attention. Not the buried storefronts in Seattle, taken alone. Not the sealed vaults in Edinburgh, taken alone. not the foundation dating discrepancies in the civic buildings of the American Midwest, taken alone, but all of them together, mapped against the same 50-year window, against the same pattern of catastrophic disruption and rapid reconstruction and documentary loss that we have been tracing through this entire documentary. When you lay those things side by side, the question that emerges is not whether something strange happened in the 19th century. The question is why the tools that exist to study it have been consistently applied to the parts and never to the whole. The document is 742 pages long, and it is free to read online. It was published in 1894 by the Smithsonian Institution, one of the most respected scientific organizations in the world, under the title Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. Its author was Cyrus Thomas, a scientist employed by the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, which had been established in 1879 under the directorship of John Wesley Powell, the same John Wesley Powell who had led the first documented expedition through the Grand Canyon in 1869, and who was, by any measure, one of the defining figures of American scientific exploration in the 19th century. The report documents the excavation of more than 2,000 burial mounds across the eastern half of the United States in Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Tennessee, North Carolina, and more than a dozen other states. It is meticulous, careful, and written in the measured language of institutional science. It describes the contents of those mounds in considerable detail. Pottery, copper ornaments, mica cutouts, carved stone pipes, textile fragments, and human skeletal remains. And in multiple entries across multiple states, it describes those skeletal remains as being of notably large stature. Not in every mound, not as a uniform finding, but consistently enough and across enough geographically separated sites that the descriptions accumulate into a pattern that is difficult to explain away as simple measurement error or excavation enthusiasm. The first annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, published in 1881, contains similar descriptions. The reports are public documents. They have been public documents for more than a century. So the starting point for this segment is not a conspiracy theory. It is a published government scientific report describing physical evidence that subsequent institutional science has found difficult to account for and has largely chosen not to address directly. To understand why that matters, you need to understand what the mounds themselves represent, because the mounds are frequently underestimated in the popular imagination in ways that obscure their actual scale and complexity. The Cahokia Mound Site, located near present-day Collinsville, Illinois, approximately 8 miles east of St. Louis, Missouri, covers approximately 6 square miles and contains the remnants of what was, at its peak around 1100 CE, one of the largest pre-Columbian cities in North America. The central feature of the site, called Monk's Mound, is a terraced earthwork covering 14 acres at its base and rising to a height of approximately 100 feet. It contains more soil by volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The city that surrounded it had an estimated population of 10,000 to 20,000 people, at its peak comparable to the population of London at the same period. Cahokia was almost entirely ignored by 19th century American historians. The mounds were there. Travelers and surveyors documented their existence. But the intellectual framework of 19th century American history, which required the continent to have been essentially empty before European arrival, in order to justify the dispossession of indigenous peoples under the doctrine of terra nullius, could not accommodate the existence of a sophisticated, densely populated urban civilization that had flourished and declined entirely before European contact. And so Cahokia occupied the same intellectual position as J. Harlan Bretz's flood evidence, visible, documented, and systematically minimized by the prevailing framework. This is the context in which the Bureau of Ethnology's mound excavation program operated. John Wesley Powell established the Bureau with a genuine scientific mandate to document and analyze the archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian North American civilization before it was destroyed by agricultural development, which was proceeding rapidly across the Midwest in the 1870s and 1880s. The mounds were being plowed under at a rate that alarmed the scientific community. Powell's response was to document as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and Cyrus Thomas's 1894 report was the primary product of that effort. The report did something else as well. something that was politically significant at the time and has remained significant since. It definitively attributed the construction of the mounds to the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples, rather than to a hypothetical vanished race of superior beings, a theory that had been popular in certain circles since at least the early 19th century, promoted in part by a pseudo-scientific literature that wanted the mounds to have been built by someone other than Native Americans, because attributing them to Native Americans complicated the narrative of indigenous inferiority that justified dispossession. Thomas's systematic analysis demolished the lost race theory on evidentiary grounds. In that respect, the 1894 report was a genuine scientific achievement, but the skeletal size descriptions remained in the report, uncommented upon and unexplained, because Thomas's primary analytical task was attribution, who built the mounds rather than physical anthropology. The measurements were recorded. They were not analyzed. They were filed. Independent researcher Richard Dewhurst, in his 2014 study, The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, undertook a systematic review of the Bureau of Ethnology's published reports alongside 19th century newspaper accounts of mound excavations across the United States. What he found was a substantial body of descriptions from scientific reports, from local newspaper accounts, from letters submitted to state historical societies of skeletal remains, whose recorded dimensions significantly exceeded those of the surrounding contemporary population. Femur lengths suggesting heights of 7 to 8 feet, skulls of unusual size and, in some cases, unusual morphology. Double rows of teeth, described in multiple independent accounts from geographically separated sites. Dewhurst's work is not peer-reviewed academic research, and that distinction matters. His methodology, the aggregation of historical accounts, without systematic critical analysis of each source's reliability, is not the methodology of institutional archaeology. Some of the newspaper accounts he cites were produced in an era when local journalism frequently embellished or fabricated sensational stories about mound excavations to generate reader interest. The evidentiary weight of a newspaper account from 1873 describing a giant skeleton found in a Wisconsin mound is not equivalent to the evidentiary weight of a Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology report. But here is where the Smithsonian's own documentation becomes relevant in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed by Congress in 1990, required all federally funded institutions holding Native American human remains to compile complete inventories of those remains and make them available for repatriation to affiliated tribal nations. The Smithsonian Institution, holding one of the largest collections of Native American skeletal material in the world, compiled its inventory and published it. The inventory documents significant gaps collections listed in 19th century acquisition records that cannot be located in current physical storage, items catalogued as received that do not correspond to any identifiable specimen in the current collection. The Smithsonian's official explanation for these gaps is a combination of repatriation under earlier informal agreements, specimen degradation over time, and cataloguing errors accumulated over more than a century of institutional record-keeping. These are all plausible explanations, individually. The aggregate scale of the inventory discrepancy, which covers thousands of individual specimens across multiple collection areas, not only mound-derived skeletal material, is something the institution has acknowledged without fully resolving. One theory suggests that skeletal material of anomalous size was systematically removed from accessible storage, either through deliberate deaccessioning or through informal removal to restricted areas of the collection, in order to avoid the complications that such material would create for the established narrative of pre-Columbian North American population history. That theory exists in the popular literature in various forms and with various degrees of evidentiary support. It cannot be confirmed from available records. What can be confirmed is that the inventory gaps are real, that the Bureau of Ethnology reports contain physical descriptions that have never been systematically followed up with modern analytical techniques, and that the institutional response to questions about both of these things has been, for decades, essentially bureaucratic rather than scientific. Archaeologist Jeffrey Gill, writing in the context of NAGPRA compliance research, has noted that the combination of 19th century collection practices, which frequently lacked rigorous provenance documentation, with 20th century storage conditions that were often inadequate for long-term preservation, and with the administrative disruptions produced by multiple institutional reorganizations within the Smithsonian across the 20th century, created conditions in which significant portions of the original collection became effectively unaccountable without any single act of deliberate concealment being necessary. The system produced the opacity. Nobody had to plan it. That observation mirrors the pattern we have been tracing across this entire documentary. The census records were not deliberately destroyed for the purpose of obscuring population history. A building caught fire. The Cook County Courthouse records were not deliberately destroyed for the purpose of obscuring property history. A city burned. The Southbridge vaults were not deliberately sealed for the purpose of obscuring their occupation history. The residents apparently left for reasons that were pragmatic at the time and are now only partially recoverable. And the skeletal material in the Smithsonian's mound collections may not have been deliberately removed for the purpose of obscuring physical evidence of anomalous human remains in pre-Columbian North America. The system, the combination of inadequate storage, poor documentation, administrative turnover, and institutional indifference to material that did not fit the prevailing analytical framework, may have produced the same result without requiring anyone to make a deliberate decision. That is actually the more unsettling conclusion. Deliberate suppression requires a suppressor, and suppressors can be identified and held accountable. Systemic opacity, produced by the accumulated weight of institutional habits and intellectual frameworks, does not have a single author. It has a culture. What remains unexplained is not only what happened to the skeletal material, what remains unexplained is why. More than a century after the Bureau of Ethnology's reports were published, no institution has undertaken a systematic modern analysis of the physical descriptions they contain, cross-referenced against the current state of the collections and the results of modern physical anthropological techniques applied to whatever material remains recoverable. The 742-page report is still there. It is still free to read. The descriptions are still in it, on the pages where Cyrus Thomas put them in 1894, waiting with the particular patience of documents that have learned, through long experience, not to expect a reply. Somewhere around 2018, a specific kind of video began appearing on YouTube. The format was consistent enough that it became recognizable almost immediately. A narrator, usually anonymous, usually speaking over a slideshow of historical photographs and old maps, would point to a building and ask why the ground floor windows were below street level. Then they would point to another building in a different city and ask the same question. Then they would show an 18th century map of Central Asia labeled with the word Tartaria or Grand Tartary, and suggest that the connection between the buried windows and the old map was not coincidental, that there had been a civilization, that it had been erased, that the erasure had been deliberate, and that the world we are living in now was built on top of the one that was destroyed, in the same way that Chicago was built on top of its original ground floor. The theory acquired a name: mud flood, the idea being that the mechanism of erasure was a catastrophic flood of mud, not water, but thick, heavy, sediment-laden water that moved slowly enough to bury structures rather than simply demolishing them, filling ground floors and lower levels while leaving upper stories intact and available for reoccupation. The buried windows were the physical evidence. The orphan trains were the repopulation mechanism. The World's Fairs were the debut of the new civilization, displaying its architecture and technology to a population that had no memory of what had come before. And Tartaria, the vast, sophisticated, energetically advanced empire that the old maps pointed to, was what had been lost. The channels that developed and circulated this framework, John Levi, Autodidactic, Stolen History, and others, accumulated audiences in the hundreds of thousands. The comment sections of their videos filled with people describing the moment of recognition they had felt when they first encountered the theory. The feeling that something they had always sensed was slightly wrong about the official story had finally been named. The feeling that the buried ground floors and the orphan trains and the gaps in the census records and the architectural anomalies were not separate curiosities but connected pieces of a single hidden picture. That feeling is worth taking seriously, because it is responding to something real. Before examining what the theory gets wrong, and it gets significant things wrong, it is worth being precise about what it gets right, because the getting right parts are not trivial. Grand Tartary, or Great Tartary, is documented in 18th century European cartography with a consistency that is not in dispute. Hermann Moll's 1736 map of Asia labels a vast region stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean as Great Tartary. The Bleu Atlas, produced in Amsterdam in the 1640s and considered one of the finest cartographic achievements of the 17th century, labels the same region with similar terminology. The 1771 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica contains a substantial entry on Tartary, describing it as the largest country in the world by area. These are real documents. They are in institutional collections. They are not fabrications. What is also not in dispute is that the region, those maps labelled as Tartary, was home to real, complex, historically significant civilizations. The Mongol Empire, which at its peak in the 13th century was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, emerged from this region. The Silk Road trading networks that connected China to Europe for centuries ran through it. The cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, now in present-day Uzbekistan, were centers of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy during periods when Western Europe was comparatively undeveloped. The cartographic label Tartary was a European designation for a region that Europeans understood poorly and represented imprecisely. But the region it imprecisely represented was not empty or primitive. The mud flood theory takes these real cartographic documents and makes a specific interpretive leap, that Tartaria was not a loosely defined geographic region populated by various Turkic, Mongolic, and Siberian peoples, but a unified, technologically sophisticated empire with capabilities particularly in the area of energy generation and transmission that exceeded those of the civilization that replaced it. That leap is not supported by the cartographic evidence. The maps that label the region as Tartary do not describe a unified empire. They describe a geographic designation applied by European cartographers to a part of the world they had limited direct knowledge of. The inconsistency of the label across different maps, different borders, different subdivisions, different levels of detail reflects European geographic uncertainty, not a hidden imperial structure. The buried ground floors are real, as this documentary has established in considerable detail. The street-raising projects in Chicago, Sacramento, and Seattle are documented in the engineering records of those cities. The underground spaces in Edinburgh and Portland are physically accessible. The pattern of surface reconstruction in the 19th century is genuine, but the mud flood theory's explanation for that pattern, a single, synchronous, global catastrophic event that buried existing structures under meters of sediment, is not supported by the physical evidence. This is the most important distinction to make carefully, because it is easy to conflate the evidence with the explanation. The evidence buried ground floors, architectural anomalies, demographic disruptions, record losses is real. The explanation offered by the mud flood framework that all of these things were produced by a single event that erased a global civilization is not supported by any sediment core, any geological survey, any isotopic dating study, or any physical analysis conducted anywhere in the world. Geologists know what synchronous global sediment deposition looks like in the record. The Chicxulub impact event 66 million years ago, which produced the mass extinction that ended the non-avian dinosaurs, left a thin layer of iridium-enriched clay detectable in geological formations across every continent. If a mud flood of sufficient scale to bury city streets across North America, Europe, and Asia had occurred in the 19th century, the sediment record would show it unambiguously. It does not. What the sediment record shows, in the specific locations where buried 19th century infrastructure exists, is localized alluvial deposition consistent with the specific documented events, the Sacramento flood of 1861 to 1862, the post-fire reconstruction fill in Chicago and Seattle that we have already examined in detail. The orphan train numbers are genuinely unusual, as this documentary has acknowledged. The demographic disruptions of the 1870s and 1880s are real, but historian Mark Laws of the University of Cincinnati, whose work on 19th century American labor history and social conditions is among the most comprehensive in the field, has documented through verified census records and institutional records that the driving forces behind the orphan trains were the documented poverty conditions produced by immigration, industrialization, and the post-Civil War economic disruptions. The children who traveled on the orphan trains came from documented families in documented cities whose documented poverty is recoverable in the records that survive. The theory that they were used to repopulate a landscape depopulated by a global catastrophe requires the absence of that documentation. But the documentation exists. The world's fairs present the most visually compelling version of the mud flood argument, and it deserves a direct response. The argument, made most forcefully in the Stolen History Channel's analysis of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, is that the scale and sophistication of the fair's architecture, the so-called White City, with its neoclassical plaster buildings covering hundreds of acres of Chicago's South Side, could not have been constructed in the 2 years available between the fair's authorization and its opening, and therefore must represent the adaptation of pre-existing structures whose true age and origin were concealed. The buildings, in this reading, were not built for the fair. They were already there. The fair was a performance of new civilization in buildings that belonged to the old one. The construction records for the 1893 fair are extensive and survive in the Chicago History Museum's archives. They document the labor force at peak construction, more than 14,000 workers on site simultaneously. They document the material supply chains, the architectural contracts, the engineering decisions made in real time as the project progressed. They document the specific innovations, the use of a steel frame structure clad in a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber called staff, which allowed rapid construction of large classical facades that made the speed of construction possible. The White City was built in approximately 2 years because the materials and methods used were specifically chosen for their speed of deployment. When the fair closed and the buildings were no longer needed, they burned easily precisely because they were staff construction, not permanent masonry. Eric Larson's 2003 study, The Devil in the White City, which draws on the construction archives and the correspondence of the fair's chief architect, Daniel Burnham, documents the extraordinary logistical effort of building the fair in the available time. The effort was genuinely extraordinary. It was also genuinely possible. And the records that document how it was done are accessible. None of this means the questions the mud flood theory is asking are bad questions. The questions are good. The feeling that the 19th century has not been fully explained by the standard narrative is a feeling that the evidence, examined carefully, supports. What the mud flood framework does with those genuine anomalies is reach for an explanation that is larger and more unified than the evidence warrants. It takes the buried ground floors, which are explained by documented local events, and attributes them to a single global catastrophe for which no physical evidence exists. It takes the orphan train numbers, which are explained by documented poverty conditions, and attributes them to a repopulation program for which no administrative record exists. It takes the cartographic label Tartaria, which refers to a real but loosely defined geographic region, and constructs from it a unified advanced civilization for which no material evidence exists. The gap between the real anomalies and the explanation offered for them is not a small gap. It is the difference between asking a genuinely important historical question and answering it with something that feels satisfying but cannot be verified. And that distinction matters, because the real story, the documented story of catastrophic disruption, institutional amnesia, record loss, and the systematic minimization of suffering in the service of a progress narrative is actually more interesting, more damning, and more recoverable than the Tartaria hypothesis allows it to be. The buried city is real. The civilization that built it just had names and addresses that are still, in many cases, findable in the archives. We simply have not looked hard enough. In the summer of 1901, on a stretch of farmland on the north shore of Long Island, New York, construction began on a tower. The design was unlike anything that had been built before. A wooden framework rising approximately 187 feet from the ground, topped by a 55-ton steel hemisphere, 55 feet in diameter, anchored below ground by a shaft, sunk 16 stories into the earth, and spreading outward at the bottom like the roots of a tree. The man who designed it described the underground component as essential. The tower, he wrote in his project notes, had to grip the earth the way a plant grips the soil, drawing from it and transmitting through it simultaneously. The tower was not intended to transmit radio waves through the air. It was intended to use the earth itself as the transmission medium. The goal, as its designer stated explicitly in correspondence that survives in institutional archives, was to make electrical power available to any point on the surface of the planet, without wires, without infrastructure, without cost at the point of use. The man who designed it was Nikola Tesla. And the story of what happened to it is one of the most precisely documented cases of technological suppression in the history of American science, not suppressed by a shadowy cabal, not erased from the record, but killed by a named man for documented financial reasons, in correspondence that you can read today. Understanding that story requires setting aside both the hagiography and the dismissal that tend to surround Tesla in popular discourse, and looking at what the documents actually say. Tesla was born in 1856 in Smiljan, a village in what is now Croatia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He emigrated to the United States in 1884 and worked briefly for Thomas Edison before the professional relationship collapsed, acrimoniously and permanently, over a dispute about compensation that Tesla documented in letters that survive. His subsequent career was built on genuine, verifiable scientific achievement. The alternating current electrical system that powers virtually every building in the world today was developed using Tesla's patents acquired by George Westinghouse and deployed at the Niagara Falls Power Station in 1895. Patent number 6, 145,576, filed in 1899 and granted in 1900, describes a system of worldwide electrical transmission using the Earth as a conductor. They are documented in the United States Patent Office records, which are publicly accessible. The financial backing for Wardenclyffe came from J. Pierpont Morgan, the most powerful banker in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. Morgan's initial investment of $150,000, equivalent to several million dollars today, was secured in 1801 on the basis of Tesla's proposal for a global wireless communication system. What Tesla did not fully disclose to Morgan at the time, and what Morgan appears to have discovered as construction progressed, was that the system Tesla was actually building was not merely a communication system, it was an energy transmission system. The communication capability was real, but secondary. The primary function of the Wardenclyffe Tower, as Tesla conceived it, was to demonstrate that electrical power could be transmitted globally without charge at the point of reception. V. Bernard Carlson, whose authorized biography of Tesla published by Princeton University Press in 2013 under the title Tesla, Inventor of the Electrical Age, is the most comprehensive and rigorously sourced study of Tesla's life and work. Documents Morgan's withdrawal of funding in detail. Morgan's reasoning, as expressed in his correspondence with Tesla, was not philosophical opposition to free energy. It was the same reasoning that has driven every major investment decision in the history of capitalism. If the power cannot be metered, it cannot generate revenue. Morgan's business model for electrical infrastructure depended entirely on the ability to charge customers for the electricity they used. A system that transmitted power globally without the ability to control access at the receiving end was not a business. It was a public utility that nobody could profit from. Morgan stopped funding Wardenclyffe in 1903. Without continued investment, construction halted. The tower stood incomplete and unused for 14 years before being demolished in 1917, reportedly to pay off Tesla's debts to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where he was living. Tesla died on January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan. He was 86 years old and had been living in near poverty for years. His later career, marked by increasingly ambitious theoretical claims and an almost complete absence of the institutional support that his earlier work had commanded. Within hours of his death, agents of the United States Office of Alien Property, acting under wartime authority, entered his room and seized his papers, notebooks, and personal effects. The seizure is documented in federal records. Tesla was a naturalized American citizen, which made the invocation of the Office of Alien Property legally questionable. But the seizure proceeded regardless. The fate of those papers is partially documented and partially not. A portion of the seized material was eventually reviewed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Office of Scientific Research and Development, declassified in stages over subsequent decades, and is now held at the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, Serbia, and at various institutions in the United States. But the inventory of what was seized and the inventory of what was eventually released do not fully correspond. Carlson's biography acknowledges the discrepancy without being able to resolve it from available sources. Some of Tesla's notebooks and correspondence from the Wardenclyffe period and later remain unaccounted for in any publicly accessible archive. This is where the documented story ends and the theoretical extensions begin. And it is important to mark that boundary clearly. The free energy claim, the assertion that Tesla had achieved or was close to achieving a working system of unlimited, unmetered global energy transmission, is not supported by the physical evidence that survives. The Wardenclyffe Tower was never completed. No working demonstration of global energy transmission was ever conducted. The patents Tesla filed describe theoretical systems, not proven devices. The engineering analysis of those patents, conducted by electrical engineers in the decades since Tesla's death, suggests that the Wardenclyffe design, as described, would not have functioned as Tesla intended because the physics of ground conduction at the frequencies Tesla proposed do not support transmission at planetary scale with the efficiency he claimed. One theory suggests that Tesla possessed knowledge or had achieved results that exceeded what his surviving patents describe, and that this knowledge was among the material removed from his hotel room in 1943 and never returned to the public record. That theory is not impossible. It is also not supported by evidence, because by definition, the evidence it would require is precisely what is claimed to be missing. What remains unexplained, and what is legitimately unexplained rather than speculatively unexplained, is narrower but still significant. Why was Wardenclyffe demolished rather than preserved or converted? The tower represented a substantial capital investment and a unique physical structure. Its demolition was motivated, at least officially, by a debt of $20,000, a sum that seems disproportionate as a reason to destroy an irreplaceable scientific installation. Why does the correspondence between Morgan and his associates about the Wardenclyffe project have limited representation in the publicly accessible Morgan archive at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, given that Morgan's papers are otherwise extensively preserved? And why, given the considerable ongoing public and scientific interest in Tesla's later theoretical work, has no institution undertaken a systematic effort to compile and publish a complete inventory of the materials seized in 1943 and their subsequent disposition? These are answerable questions in principle. They are questions that archival research, applied with sufficient rigor and institutional support, could address. The fact that they have not been fully addressed is not evidence of conspiracy. It is evidence of institutional indifference to a figure who was, by the end of his life, regarded by the scientific establishment as an eccentric rather than a pioneer, and whose rehabilitation in popular memory has occurred primarily outside the institutions that would have the resources to pursue the archival questions seriously. The adjacent claim that Tesla's work represented the rediscovery of energy principles known to prior civilizations, including the hypothetical Tartarian civilization discussed in the previous segment, has no evidentiary foundation whatsoever. It is a narrative connection, not an evidential one. It links two anomalies: the unexplained aspects of Tesla's later work and the unexplained aspects of 19th century architectural and demographic history, through the mechanism of thematic resonance rather than documented fact. The resonance is real, the connection is not. What the Tesla story actually demonstrates, stripped of the mythological overlay it has acquired, is something more precise and more useful than the free energy narrative. It demonstrates that a specific, named individual developed a specific, documented technology that threatened the revenue model of a specific, named financial interest, and that the financial interest acted through the entirely legal and entirely transparent mechanism of withdrawing investment to ensure that the technology was never completed. No conspiracy, no secret society, one man with a checkbook and a business model to protect, making a decision that was rational within his framework and catastrophic within the framework of the civilization that might have benefited from what Tesla was building. That is a story about power, about who decides which technologies get developed and which ones do not, about the relationship between scientific possibility and economic permission. And it is a story that is fully documented, fully sourced, and fully available to anyone willing to read the biography. The tower is gone. The papers are partially missing. The questions that remain are real questions. But the answer to those questions, insofar as the evidence allows an answer, points not toward a hidden civilization and not toward suppressed ancient knowledge. It points toward a banker in New York in 1903, looking at a funding request and asking the only question that, within his framework, mattered. Where does the meter go? There is a version of this documentary that would be easier to make. In that version, the suppression of historical knowledge is the work of a nameless, faceless, coordinated power, a shadow organization operating across centuries, erasing inconvenient evidence, managing the narrative, ensuring that the population never learns what was taken from them. That version is emotionally satisfying in a specific way. It provides a unified explanation for a diffuse set of observations. It gives the viewer a single enemy, and it neatly absolves the institutions and the individuals who actually made the decisions that shaped what we know and what we do not know about the 19th century. Because when the blame is everywhere and nameless, it is effectively nowhere and accountable to no one. This segment is the harder version, the version with names, because the suppression that actually occurred in the 19th and early 20th century did not require a shadow organization. It required something considerably more ordinary and considerably more durable. The rational self-interest of powerful people operating within systems that gave them the tools to manage inconvenient information without ever having to explicitly agree to do so. The infrastructure of suppression was not secret. It was the legal system, the press, the financial system, and the federal bureaucracy, the same institutions that were simultaneously being presented to the American public as the guarantors of truth and accountability. Begin in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, on the afternoon of May 31st, 1889. The South Fork Dam had been built in the 1840s as a water supply reservoir for the Pennsylvania Canal System. When the canal system became obsolete following the expansion of the railroad network, the dam and its reservoir were sold, changed hands several times, and eventually purchased in 1879 by Benjamin Ruff on behalf of a group of Pittsburgh investors who wanted a private recreational retreat. The group incorporated as the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Its membership, over the following decade, came to include Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, Philander Knox, who would later serve as Attorney General of the United States under Presidents McKinley and Roosevelt, and approximately 60 other men who represented, in aggregate, a significant portion of the industrial and financial power of western Pennsylvania. The dam had been modified by the club to accommodate a road across its top and to prevent the escape of fish from the reservoir. Modifications that engineers documented at the time and in subsequent analysis as having compromised its structural integrity and reduced its capacity to handle high water events. Multiple engineers submitted warnings, in writing, that the dam was inadequate for the volume of water it was holding. Those warnings were not acted upon. When the dam failed on May 31st, 1889, the wall of water that reached Johnstown 14 miles downstream was moving at approximately 40 miles per hour and carried, along with 30 million tons of water, the accumulated debris of everything in its path. 2,209 people died. The entire downtown district of Johnstown was destroyed. Bodies were still being recovered months later. The legal response was essentially nothing. Historian David McCullough, in his 1968 study of the flood, documents the legal proceedings, or rather, the absence of them in detail. Pennsylvania law at the time recognized a doctrine called assumption of risk that made it extraordinarily difficult to hold upstream property owners liable for downstream flood damage. The club's lawyers, who included some of the most capable legal minds available to Carnegie and Frick's money, ensured that every legal action brought against the club was either dismissed or settled for nominal amounts. Not a single member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club paid meaningful legal damages for the deaths of 2,209 people. The press management was equally deliberate. The club organized and publicized its charitable contributions to Johnstown relief efforts, generating favorable coverage in the Pittsburgh newspapers, several of which were owned by or financially dependent on advertising from the industrial interests connected to the club's membership. The local Johnstown newspaper, the Johnstown Tribune, ran editorials in the months following the flood that pointed clearly toward the club's negligence. The editor, a man named George Swank, documented the pressure he received from local businessmen with ties to club members to soften his coverage. The connection between that moderation and the economic pressure brought to bear on his newspaper is documented in the paper's own archives, which survive at the Johnstown Area Heritage Association. The Johnstown story is the clearest single case in the 19th century of named individuals using named legal and financial mechanisms to manage the public record of their culpability for a mass casualty event. But it is not the only one, and it is not even the most consequential one. In the spring and summer of 1927, the Mississippi River produced the largest flood in its recorded history to that point. The river breached its levees in 145 places. Approximately 27,000 square miles of land were inundated across 7 states. The official death toll was 246, a number that historians of the event have consistently described as a significant undercount for reasons that are directly related to the suppression mechanism at work. The relief effort was organized and led by Herbert Hoover, then serving as Secretary of Commerce under President Coolidge, and widely regarded in the press at the time as a model of administrative competence. Hoover's management of the relief effort was extensively covered by national newspapers and directly contributed to his successful presidential campaign the following year. What the national press coverage did not report, and what remained largely absent from the public record until historian John Barry published his comprehensive study Rising Tide in 1997, was the condition under which the approximately 330,000 black residents of the flooded areas received or failed to receive relief. The Red Cross relief camps established across the flooded region were racially segregated. Black refugees were housed in separate, consistently inferior facilities. In multiple documented locations, black men were prevented from leaving relief camps and compelled to perform levee repair labor under armed guard. In some areas, black residents who attempted to evacuate before the flood were turned back by armed white men who needed their labor for sandbag operations and were willing to use force to keep them in the flood zone. Barry's research, drawn from Red Cross internal documents, the papers of the NAACP, the correspondence of the African American press, particularly the Chicago Defender, which reported what the white national press would not, and the personal papers of Hoover himself, establishes that Hoover was aware of the conditions in the segregated camps, that he received specific, documented complaints from black leaders, including Robert Rusamoton, the president of the Tuskegee Institute, and that he made explicit promises to address those conditions in exchange for the political support of black voters in his upcoming presidential campaign. After the election, the promised federal commission on conditions in the relief camps was quietly shelved. The documentation of this sequence, the complaints, the promises, the election, the shelving, exists in Hoover's own papers at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. The suppression of this story was not the work of a conspiracy. It was the work of the Associated Press wire service, which in 1927 remained the primary conduit for national news distribution, and which, as Richard Schwartzlos documented in his study of the wire service's history, operated with an editorial culture that systematically underweighted stories originating from black sources and black communities. It was the work of the white-owned national newspapers, whose editors made individual decisions, day by day, about which stories from the flooded region were worth the wire space. And it was the work of Herbert Hoover's press operation, which was sophisticated, well-funded, and specifically focused on managing the national narrative of the relief effort in ways that served Hoover's political interests. None of those people met in a room. None of them signed an agreement. The suppression emerged from the intersection of individual self-interest, institutional culture, and structural racial inequality. The same forces that produced the Johnstown outcome, that produced the Cook County record loss, that produced the Bureau of Indian Affairs trust account destruction documented in Cobell versus Norton. The Bureau of Indian Affairs case deserves its own direct statement, because it is the most formally adjudicated of the suppression cases covered in this documentary. The Cobell versus Norton lawsuit, filed in 1996 by Eloise Cobell, a member of the Blackfeet Nation and a banker who had spent years trying to reconcile federal trust account records for indigenous land holdings, established through federal court proceedings that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had mismanaged, lost, and in documented cases deliberately destroyed trust account records covering indigenous land holdings going back to the 1880s. The federal government's liability, established by the court, that was eventually settled in 2010 for $3.4 billion, the largest class action settlement against the federal government in American history. The records that would have established individual land ownership and population continuity for hundreds of thousands of people across more than a century were gone. The court established that their destruction was not entirely accidental. The settlement amount reflects, in the language of financial accountability, the scale of what was suppressed. These are the suppressions with names and dates: Carnegie and Frick and the South Fork Dam, Hoover and the flooded camps, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and a century of trust account records, the Associated Press and its editorial culture, the Pittsburgh newspapers and their advertising dependencies. The machinery of forgetting, examined at this level of specificity, is not a mystery. It is a ledger, and every entry in it has an author. What changes when you see it this way, when you replace the nameless shadow organization with the named, documented, financially motivated decisions of specific individuals and institutions, is not the scale of the suppression. The scale is the same. What changes is the accountability. And accountability, unlike conspiracy, is something that the historical record was actually designed to support. The names are there. They have always been there. They were just easier to look past when the alternative explanation was so much larger and so much more conveniently impossible to verify. There is a reason this idea keeps coming back. Not the specific claims about Tartaria, not the mud flood mechanism. Those specific claims have been examined in this documentary against the available evidence, and the evidence does not support them in the forms their proponents present them. That assessment is not going to change with more YouTube videos or more photographs of basement windows. But the feeling that drives people toward those claims, the feeling that the official story of the 19th century is somehow smaller than the actual events, that the textbook version of industrial progress and manifest destiny leaves out something large and important and human, that feeling is not wrong. That feeling is, in fact, one of the more historically accurate responses available to anyone who has looked carefully at what the 19th century actually contained. Consider what a person living through the first half of the 19th century in North America actually experienced. They were born into a world that had just been shaken, literally, by the most powerful earthquakes in continental American history, earthquakes that reversed the flow of the Mississippi River and created a lake overnight in Tennessee. They grew up in the aftermath of a volcanic eruption on the other side of the world that had turned their summers cold and killed their crops for 2 consecutive years, and emptied the farming communities of New England in ways that no one had a framework to fully explain. They lived through cholera pandemics that killed their neighbors within hours of first symptoms. They watched cities burn. They watched the Mississippi flood so comprehensively in 1861 and 1862 that the Central Valley of California became an inland sea, and a governor rode to his own inauguration, and a third of the state's taxable wealth simply ceased to exist. And then, over the following decades, they watched the story of those events get compressed, smoothed, fitted into a narrative of inevitable progress in which the disasters were footnotes and the triumphs were the subject. The railroad, the telegraph, the world's fairs with their gleaming plaster cities, the census numbers climbing, the cities growing, the frontier moving westward with a momentum that the official story described as destiny, rather than the consequence of successive catastrophes that had displaced hundreds of thousands of people from wherever they had been before. The mud flood theory, at its emotional core, is a refusal of that compression. It is an insistence that something was lost, that the world before the Reconstruction era was more complex, more sophisticated, more fully inhabited than the progress narrative allows. And that insistence is not wrong. The world before the Reconstruction era was more complex than the textbooks acknowledge. The people who lived through the catastrophes of the early and middle 19th century were not blank slates waiting to be written upon by industrial capitalism. They had land and languages and communities and knowledge and histories that the Reconstruction era, in its relentless forward momentum, genuinely did compress and genuinely did minimize, and in some documented cases genuinely did destroy. What the mud flood theory does with that legitimate grievance is reach for an explanation that is mythological rather than historical. It projects the complexity and sophistication that was lost backward into a hypothetical civilization, Tartaria, that carries the weight of everything the progress narrative excluded. And it gives the suppression of that complexity a single, unified cause: the mud flood, the reset, the deliberate erasure rather than the distributed, mundane, economically motivated suppressions that actually occurred. The mythological version is more satisfying than the historical version in almost every aesthetic respect. It has a grandeur that the documented suppressions lack. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club denying liability for the deaths of 2,209 people is a story about greed and legal privilege and institutional cowardice. It is an ugly, specific, entirely human story. The story of a global civilization erased by a catastrophic flood and replaced by orphan children with no memory of what came before is a story of cosmic scale and tragic beauty, the kind of story that feels proportionate to the scale of loss it is describing. But proportionality of feeling is not evidence, and the distance between the emotional truth of the mud flood theory and its factual content is precisely the distance between the history we were given and the history that actually happened. Both distances are real, they just point in opposite directions. The history we were given is too small. The official story of the 19th century, as taught in most American schools, genuinely does minimize the catastrophes, the displacements, the suppressions, and the human cost of the era it celebrates. That minimization is documented and demonstrable. It is the product of identifiable choices made by identifiable people operating within identifiable ideological frameworks. It is not adequate to the reality it purports to describe. The mud flood explanation is too large. It reaches past the documented evidence into a framework that feels comprehensive but is not supported by the physical record. It answers the right questions with the wrong answers, and in doing so, it paradoxically serves the same function as the progress narrative it sets out to challenge. It makes the actual, documented, named suppressions harder to see by covering them with a layer of mythological explanation that is, ultimately, as comfortable in its way as the official story it replaces. Both versions, the triumphalist progress narrative and the Tartarian reset theory, offer their audiences a completed picture, a story with a shape, an explanation that accounts for the anomalies and resolves the discomfort of not knowing. The progress narrative resolves the discomfort by denying the anomalies. The reset theory resolves the discomfort by explaining them through a mechanism that cannot be verified or falsified. Both resolutions are, in the end, a form of rest, a place to stop looking. What the evidence actually supports is considerably more uncomfortable than either version, because it does not resolve into a completed picture. It resolves into a set of documented facts with gaps between them that have not been filled, questions that have not been answered, and archives that have not been fully examined. It resolves into the recognition that the 19th century was both more catastrophic than the progress narrative acknowledges and more recoverable than the reset theory implies. The records that survive are extensive. The physical evidence that survives is extensive. The tools for analyzing both are available, and in some cases have barely been applied to the specific questions this documentary has raised. J. Harlan Bretz was right about the Missoula floods for 42 years before the institution that had dismissed him acknowledged it. He was right not because he had access to information that his colleagues lacked, but because he was willing to let the landscape tell him what it showed rather than what he expected it to show. The evidence for the floods was always there. The problem was the lens through which the 19th century has been examined, the uniformitarian, progressivist lens that smoothed the catastrophes into footnotes and the suppressions into administrative oversights, is not the only lens available. It is not even the most accurate lens available. It is simply the one that was handed to most people along with their education. And lenses that are handed to you rarely feel like lenses. They feel like vision itself. This documentary has tried to offer a different lens. Not the Tartarian lens, which replaces one incomplete picture with another. A lens ground from the specific, dated, sourced, named material of the actual historical record, the geological surveys, the Bureau of Ethnology reports, the engineering archives, the census records that survive. The court documents, the personal letters, the death records, the newspaper accounts, from the editors who were pressured and the communities whose stories were not wired to the Associated Press. Through that lens, the 19th century looks like what it was: a period of extraordinary human endurance under conditions that were catastrophic in ways the official story has never fully acknowledged, managed by institutions whose relationship with truth was consistently subordinated to their relationship with money and power, and survived by ordinary people whose experience of it was as far from the progress narrative as experience can get, while still producing the world that we are living in now. The mud flood idea will not die because the need it is answering is real. The need to believe that something was lost. The need to believe that the world before the Reconstruction era was richer and more complex than the world that replaced it. The need to believe that the gap between the official story and the lived reality was not accidental. Those needs are legitimate. They are historically grounded. They deserve answers that are as serious as the questions. The answers are in the archives. They are in the geological surveys. They are in the 742-page Smithsonian report that has been sitting quietly online for more than a century, waiting for someone to read it all the way through. They are in the personal letters held at the Wisconsin Historical Society and the engineering records at the Sacramento Archives, and the court documents from Cobell versus Norton and the suppressed editorial files at the Johnstown Area Heritage Association. They are not hidden. They are simply sitting in the places where serious, patient, unglamorous research goes to find things in the quiet rooms, where the records that survived are kept, available to anyone willing to look without the comfort of a completed picture, without the resolution of a unified explanation, and without the expectation that history, examined honestly, will turn out to be either as clean as the progress narrative or as grand as the reset theory.